Well, dear presidents, dear honorable members of the Academy, so I will start by giving the shortest answer, and then I will try to give you some arguments for the shortest answer to the question, could a robot be conscious? So the shortest answer is no. I think the answer is true. And now I will go into why I think the answer is true, which is the interesting work, not so much the result. The paper that you have has two parts. Part one deals with the question why there couldn't be any conscious robots, and part two deals with the question what is the human being and why human beings aren't robots and shouldn't be modeled in those terms. And then I draw some ethical conclusions for this, why I do believe that the human being is the center of all ethical attention, and that we derive ethical attention for other animals and inanimate nature from that standpoint. So that's basically the structure of the talk. So let's start with the notion of consciousness with which I'm working. As also Stan Dern points out in his paper, the word consciousness has many meanings, and it's way more complicated than that. It has many meanings in one language, and it has very different meanings across languages. All those meanings are artifacts of philosophical theorizing. There is no natural, as it were, meaning to the word consciousness. The history, if you just look at the history of consciousness, consciousness first used in the history of human explicit thinking about the phenomenon that we're dealing with in Plato's Apology, to be precise. It's syneidesis in Greek. From there it moves via Augustine and a complicated medieval history into the meaning conscientia, and then this turns into consciousness talks in complicated ways and becomes somewhat vulgarized in contemporary parlance, which often doesn't take the history of the term into account. So there's a very complicated history, and if you look into various other languages, things become obviously much more difficult. There's no exact equivalent of consciousness in Chinese, so you have to talk about this. So there's no term that picks it out. Plus, as I said, in no single language is there a clear meaning of consciousness. And you cannot get the meaning of consciousness by just opening a dictionary. That would be terrible methodology, because dictionaries are produced by linguists, so linguists deploy certain methodologies. Linguists do not necessarily consult, obviously, the history of philosophy when looking into this, so it's incredibly hard to say what you're talking about when you're talking about consciousness. And as you will see in part two of my presentation, that is part of the answer. So I'm not saying there's just this mess, we will never figure this out, or let's just focus on one meaning on consciousness and so forth. I think the phenomenon that we're dealing with is messy. So the messiness is the phenomenon. So it's not just an era of humans speaking about a phenomenon. The phenomenon itself is interestingly messy. Okay, so part one then, why there couldn't be any conscious robots. So I take the elements of the question to quite literally. So we want to know what it would be for something to be a conscious robot, so why there could not be any conscious robot. So there's an ontological question. What does it take for something to be conscious and a robot and so forth? And then there's the interesting modal question, could something be a robot? I think most of us would agree that there aren't any conscious robots right now, which is why we ask the question, could there be any in the future? So let's define a couple of terms before we start moving. So let me start by robot. So throughout I will use the term robot in order to refer at this stage to non-biological artifacts of human industry. Okay, so humans produce robots, and these robots serve certain functions, typically functions that are served by humans elsewhere. That's why we produce them. They can be useful. This is what a robot is. We do not currently have biological robots, so I'm bracketing the question, not entirely, I will get back to that, whether we could have robots run by cerebral organoids. That's in principle possible, but these would be very different creatures. So I would still hold that they are not conscious, but my arguments are not directed against these kinds of entities. So that would be a different beast. Okay, so if you had a literal neural network, not a silicon network with neural properties built into a robot. Okay, so that's a different discussion. So I'm not dealing with that. So, and now let me say a few things about consciousness. So for one thing, I think consciousness is something that you can only know of by being it. Okay, so I can know that Sicily exists without being Sicily. I can know that Rome exists without being Rome. I can know that the number 7 exists without being the number 7. But I cannot know that consciousness exists without being conscious. So I think consciousness is something whose existence was noticed in the history of the universe only by conscious agents. It would be surprising, of course, if there were aliens and they came to Earth and they didn't have consciousness and they found consciousness. That would change my claim, but I think they couldn't know what consciousness is. So as a matter of fact, at least of human history, that something is conscious has been discovered by conscious creatures. So consciousness is ontologically transparent, but that does not mean, of course, that we know what consciousness is by being conscious, okay? So we are fallible about consciousness, otherwise it wouldn't be real. I use the term real throughout this paper and in my entire work to refer to something about which we are fallible. So I don't think there's anything that we are not fallible about. That would not exist by this definition of existence with which I'm working. So in that sense, were qualia infallibly knowable entities, they wouldn't exist. So clearly, if this is what we mean by qualia, there aren't any qualia. But if we mean by qualia conscious states such that we can only know that they exist in virtue of being them, so I can know that I'm in pain in virtue of being in pain and so forth, then they are qualia, but I'm fallible about them. So I would even think that I can be fallible about my own pain because, you know, I might have pain and I misidentify the cause of the pain and so forth. All of this is well studied, obviously, by psychologists and neuroscientists and so forth. So this is what I mean by consciousness then. It's a process we can only know in virtue of having or rather being it. I think we can distinguish, this is at least how I'm doing this, I'm setting up definitions here. We can distinguish between two kinds of consciousness, so-called phenomenal consciousness and so-called intentional consciousness. By phenomenal consciousness, I refer to the kind of, I call this the background noise of the organism. So our entire organism gives out information, and the background noise of this information, the overall state, you know, that's the what is it likeness, what is it like for me to be here right now. I can now begin to identify certain elements. It feels a certain way to sit here, right? It feels a certain way to utter my words. I'm adjusting what I say to potential reactions of potential interlocutors and so forth. So I can begin to characterize this overall state. And what I am characterizing, if I do it in this way, is what I call phenomenal consciousness. Intentional consciousness is a systemic relationship between a whole animal and its environment. So I can think about, for instance, the Vatican, and now I'm intentionally conscious of the Vatican. All sorts of things can happen in my phenomenal consciousness while I am intentionally conscious of the Vatican, and different things will happen in your phenomenal consciousness while you are conscious of the Vatican. So there's no, not even a correlation between being conscious of the Vatican and any specific phenomenal mental state that you're in, right? In any messy phenomenal state that you're in, you can think about the Vatican and there's no clear relationship between phenomenal consciousness and intentional consciousness in that sense. However, there is intentional consciousness. I can be conscious of the Vatican. You can block this with the help of machinery, right? You can interact with my brain, and I can thereby stop being conscious of the Vatican, which I think proves that intentional consciousness is a feature among other things of the animal, but given that my consciousness is essentially of the Vatican, when it is of the Vatican, it is very clear to me that consciousness is a systemic feature. So intentional consciousness is a relation between a whole animal and its environment. So that's a different concept. I think there are two processes here to be characterized. One has to be dealt with systemically, and for the sake of scientific investigation of the other, we can abstract from the systemic feature, which leaves it entirely open what the relationship between the two is, right? So there can be good and meaningful questions can be asked about the relationship between the two and so forth, right? In particular, when it comes to difficult questions such as the consciousness of dreaming and so forth, right? So can I dream of the Vatican can be an interesting and hard question. I think I can dream of the Vatican because I have seen it. Could someone who has never been in touch with the Vatican in waking life dream of the Vatican? I would say no, okay? So this is how I deal with the dreaming option. I'm a so-called disjunctivist, so disjunctivists believe that there are two kinds of experience. one which deals with an external object, such as the Vatican, and experience that doesn't. Dreaming experience does not necessarily refer to anything beyond dreaming experience. By coincidence, it can. I dream of the rain while it's raining, so there are these complicated side issues. But again, so if I had never been a full human being, but a so-called brain in a vat in the famous thought experiment, so if I only were a brain stimulated by scientists, I don't even think they could exist, but that's for the sake of the thought experiment, then I couldn't even think of the Vatican, even though it would look to me, as it were, as if I was thinking about the Vatican, but I wouldn't be thinking about the Vatican. Now, ontologically speaking, current robots, if you look at how they're built, as opposed to how animals are structured, do not have the relevant form of organization. They're just not organisms, which doesn't exclude that we could build robots in the future, far future, that are much more like organisms. You know, robotics is making progress in that, but they're not yet organisms. So ontologically speaking, as I say in my paper, robots are more like a beach than like a bee. So a beach doesn't have a lot of unity. It's sand, right? So if you think, in addition to there being sand, there's also a beach, you're describing the way in which the scene appears to you. But from a purely scientific point of view, you might say in the universe, right, in the universe without humans, there's just a beach. And I think robots have this ontology. So without human-machine interaction, there's zero consciousness in robots, and also, let me add, zero intelligence. So I don't think there's any artificial intelligence. Not yet. Zero. I think the degree of intelligence is zero, and so is the degree of consciousness. Because the ontology, the mereology, so the part-whole relation of the entity, in this particular case, simply precludes that. Okay? So I think believing that current robots or the internet or computers are conscious or could be conscious or are intelligent or could be intelligent is epistemically as good as believing, or worse than believing actually, that a galaxy could be conscious. So if I were to place my bets, I would say it's more likely that the entire universe is conscious or a galaxy is conscious than that a robot is conscious. So I think robots are, ontologically speaking, like beaches. Consciousness isn't, because consciousness is a process in organisms, as far as we know, and intentional consciousness is even more, it's a systemic process in an ecological niche. So I take it that I call the view biological externalism. I think consciousness is biological through and through. So if we could build, so I agree, if there could be, if we would build something out of biological matter, that would look a little odd to us, say, not entirely anthropoid, right, but would evolve in suitable ways, then that might very well be conscious. I'm not denying that at all, right? And if I found, and I don't think there are zombies, philosophical zombies are not computers that perform all human functions, they look exactly like humans, even if you open their skulls, there are neurons inside and so forth, and they are not conscious. I deny that. Right? So if we could build something that is identical to a human being, but it was built by us, but that would have to have neurons and so forth, that would be conscious, right? But take the same thing in silicon, zero consciousness, okay? So that's the view. So I don't believe that they're zombies. So there I'm an identity theorist. Now, let's come to the modal question. So could robots be conscious? Well, I think currently, this is what I would like to call an extremely weak possibility. So a possibility is extremely weak if, one, nothing we actually know supports it, and two, we have no reason to believe that the possibility amounts to a logical contradiction. So we have no reason to believe that it's a contradiction that robots are conscious or could be conscious, but we have no reason to believe that they could be conscious. So it's an extremely weak possibility. You can enhance this possibility by becoming a so-called functionalist. So you have to identify consciousness with a function, and you have to believe in multiple realizability, which is an independent claim. So you have to argue that consciousness, one, is a function in organisms, but it's a function that could be copied in non-biological materials. So there are two claims involved. Functionalism alone doesn't suffice to establish that robots could be conscious in the future. You need to also to believe in multiple realizability. And there's zero evidence for, scientific evidence for multiple realizability of consciousness, because we haven't realized consciousness. Had we would of course have a lot of evidence for multiple realizability, but we have exactly zero evidence for multiple realizability. However, functionalism raises the modal stakes. So functionalism means that robots are weakly possible, not extremely weakly possible, because you have some kind of minimal evidence, scientific evidence for the study of consciousness, but that's still very weak possibility, okay? So I'm not saying, this is not a big move. It looks like more of a maneuver towards robots, conscious robots than it is. So that's what I say in the first part of the paper. Let me just add that consciousness is not self-consciousness. I would also distinguish in a similar way C1, C2 for different reasons, but I agree with that distinction. So I think consciousness is a real phenomenon which can exist in, you know, insects, bees. We don't know how far it goes down in the Scala Naturae. We just don't know because we don't even have the minimal neural correlate of consciousness. Once we have that, global workspace, IIT, whatever is the right candidate, then we could start answering the question whether crocodiles are conscious and so forth. Currently, we just have no clue whatsoever, okay? We have educated guesses. I'm all for dogs. And primates and so forth, but, and mammals, but we just don't know that, okay? It would be absurd to claim that we currently know, so we just don't. If we had that, then things would look very different. So that would be a big step ahead. So let me come to the second part of my paper. Okay, just a short argument where you can see that there are two forms of consciousness. Right? If consciousness were self-conscious, then only self-conscious entities would be conscious. We have good reasons to believe that many animals are not self-conscious, but this should not entail that we have good reasons to believe that they are not conscious, because we know that we don't have that evidence. Therefore, that's a simple argument. Consciousness and self-consciousness are not identical. There have also been the best reasons I could imagine, from Hegel to Dieter Henrich in the German tradition of philosophy of consciousness, which have established, including Fichte and so forth, that not all conscious states are self-conscious states, right? So you can be conscious without being conscious of your consciousness. Otherwise, you would run into a terrible regress, because then either self-consciousness is conscious or not, and if self-consciousness is conscious, then you have, you see infinitary many states. No organism can have infinitary many computations. Therefore, consciousness is not identical to self-consciousness. So my second part then, I will be much more brief and say something about the human being and the human context within which we are currently operating. So I also would have quoted Know Thyself, because this is the origin of the concept of the human being as we currently have it. Sapiens, Carl Linnaeus famously coined the term, and instead of defining humans, he famously said in Systema Naturae, humans are entities that look like humans. That's not very helpful. Plus, know thyself, nosce te ipsum. That's what he says, right? And this is again a reference to Plato, Plato's Apology, because famously Socrates is the wisest of all people, sapientia, because he's the only one who tries so much as to answer the question what it is to be a human being. And Socrates says, well, try to answer it for yourself. So nosce te ipsum, this is what Linnaeus says. And now I turn this into something substantial. Okay, so the view is that human beings are the kinds of agents that sometimes act in light of a conception of what it takes to be such an agent. This is the concept of autonomy. So autonomous agents are agents which sometimes act in light of a conception of what it takes to be such an agent. That's why humans have science. So all human sciences are, among other things, responses to the question what the human being is, right? Not a fermion, not a galaxy, may be identical to some subset of the brain, not to the entire brain, but to whatever it is, we don't know, or to the animal we are, but these are all answers to the question what the human being is. This is why all science is trivially at the service of the human being, because it is an attempt by the human being to answer the question what kind of an agent it is. Part of science is philosophy. Philosophy, among other things, has to deal with the important question when it comes to the human being, whether we have an immortal soul or not. This came up in the bishop's presentation this morning. If we have an immortal soul, right, then we have to relate to the human being in quite a different way. So we can't ignore the philosophical discussion, ancient and contemporary, about whether we have an immortal soul. I'm neither arguing for it nor against it here. That would be an entire talk. But it would just be ignorant to ignore that kind of discussion, okay? So what it takes for a human being to have an immortal soul. The immortal soul might very well be the form, you mentioned entelechia, the form of an organism. I'm neutral on that. I don't have a philosophy that gives me a definite answer, but it's a candidate, right? So another candidate would be we're sophisticated killer apes designed to spread their genes. That would be another answer. But regardless of which answer you give, all those answers will be a self-determination of the human being, therefore an exercise in free will. So that's the picture with, from which I'm starting. So the mess associated with the term consciousness is a self-objectivation of human free will, and therefore not a random mess that we could ever reduce and get rid of. Eliminative materialism and any of its versions where you get rid of this entire vocabulary, simplify it, get rid of the mess, is nothing but the wish, the very human wish to deny one's own humanity. I close here and leave the rest for discussion.